In the United States, corruption doesn't always involve cash in envelopes. Sometimes it involves spreadsheets. In one case, companies legally donated millions to influence laws written by the same people who later worked for them. In another, regulators fined corporations less than they earned from breaking the rules and called it enforcement. And in more than one instance, officials traded stocks tied directly to industries they were overseeing while filing the required disclosures on time. None of this was hidden. Most of it was documented. Much of it was perfectly legal. So why does corruption in the U.S. so often look less like a crime and more like a user manual? Tonight isn't about scandals everyone already knows. It's about 50 weird and ridiculous facts that show how money doesn't always break the system. Sometimes it just learns how to use it. Before we start counting, it's important to be precise about what this video is and what it isn't. This isn't a list of crimes. It isn't a takedown of individuals. And it isn't an argument about politics. Most of what you're about to hear was legal at the time it happened. Much of it still is. That's the point. In the U.S., corruption doesn't always violate the law. It often operates inside it, through disclosures, exemptions, settlements, and procedures that technically satisfy the rules while quietly defeating their purpose. What makes these cases weird isn't how secretive they were, it's how openly they functioned. Money moved through approved channels. Influence followed formal processes. Conflicts of interest were acknowledged, disclosed, and then allowed to continue. Nothing here relies on rumors or accusations. Every example is tied to documented actions, court filings, government reports, regulatory settlements, or official disclosures. What you'll notice is a pattern where enforcement exists, but consequences don't scale. Where oversight is present, but authority is diluted, and where penalties are treated less like deterrence and more like operating costs. From this point on, we'll count them one by one, not as scandals, but as mechanisms. Each fact shows how money didn't need to break the system to shape outcomes. It just needed to learn the language the system already spoke. And once that language becomes routine, corruption stops looking dramatic. It starts looking procedural. That's when it becomes hardest to see and easiest to normalize. 1. In the 1990s, U.S. tobacco companies legally spent millions lobbying Congress while publicly denying health risks. Internal documents later surfaced during federal litigation, showing executives understood the dangers. Settlements followed, but lobbying itself remained lawful. The strange part wasn't the deception. It was how long the influence pipeline stayed open after the evidence became public. 2. In 2008, major financial institutions received government bailouts while paying bonuses approved under existing contracts. Congressional hearings criticized the optics, but no laws were broken. Treasury reports confirmed compliance with bailout terms. Public outrage focused on morality. The mechanism itself stayed untouched. 3. Between 2010 and 2020, members of Congress disclosed stock trades involving industries overseen by their committees. The transactions were reported under ethics rules and reviewed without criminal findings. Inspector General reports flagged appearance concerns, not violations. The behavior wasn't hidden, it was filed correctly. 4. In the early 2000s, defense contractors repeatedly received no-bid contracts during declared emergencies. Government Accountability Office reviews noted inflated costs but cited legal emergency provisions. Investigations produced recommendations, not reversals. The system allowed speed to outrank scrutiny, on paper and in practice. 5. In 2012, a major bank paid a multi-billion-dollar settlement for regulatory violations without admitting wrongdoing. Court documents outlined the conduct, while prosecutors cited systemic risk as a reason to avoid trial. The fine was large. The business continued, uninterrupted. 6. During the 2010s, pharmaceutical companies legally extended drug patents through minor reformulations, delaying generics. Federal court filings upheld the practice under existing law. Regulators acknowledged higher consumer costs, but lacked authority to intervene. Innovation became a procedural loophole. 7. In 2016, lobbyists helped draft portions of legislation affecting industries they represented, according to disclosed meeting records. Ethics rules required transparency, not exclusion. Lawmakers defended the process as expertise sharing. Influence arrived wearing a name badge. 8. In multiple cases, environmental fines against corporations amounted to a fraction of the profits earned from violations. EPA settlement documents confirmed compliance with penalty guidelines. Critics called it ineffective deterrence. The math still cleared. 9. After leaving office, former regulators frequently accepted jobs with firms they once oversaw. Cooling-off periods were observed as required by law. Ethics disclosures showed compliance. Oversight didn't end. It changed employers. 10 federal agencies have repeatedly relied on self-reporting by corporations to monitor compliance. Inspector General reports noted gaps, but cited resource limits. Violations were acknowledged, documented, and negotiated. Enforcement existed, it just arrived by email. After 10 examples, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. None of these cases depended on secrecy. They worked because they were processed correctly. Paperwork was filed, disclosures were made, settlements were negotiated. At every step, the system acknowledged what was happening and allowed it to continue. What stands out isn't the scale of the money, it's the consistency of the method. Influence doesn't need to break the law if the law already accounts for it. Penalties don't deter if they're priced in. Oversight doesn't interrupt if it arrives after the outcome is locked. In each case, enforcement existed. It just arrived with limits. What looks ridiculous in hindsight often looked routine at the time, because routine is how normalization works. Nothing here required a conspiracy, only compliance. And once corruption becomes procedural, it stops looking like misconduct. It starts looking like a workflow. 11. In 2001, several energy firms legally influenced state-level deregulation policies before exploiting price volatility. Subsequent investigations and court records documented market manipulation tactics, yet lobbying itself remained lawful. Penalties targeted specific behaviors, not the influence pipeline that shaped the rules in advance. 12. Throughout the 2000s, defense contractors routinely funded think tanks that later published policy reports favoring increased military spending. Disclosures listed sponsors, and no laws were broken. Congressional citations treated the research as independent expertise. The funding was transparent. The influence was indirect by design. 13. In 2009, federal regulators approved settlements with firms accused of misleading investors, allowing them to pay fines without admitting liability. Court filings detailed the conduct. The absence of admissions limited future accountability. Enforcement occurred. Closure came without precedent. 14. During the 2010s, state pension funds invested in private equity firms that charged complex fees disclosed only in supplementary documents. Audits later revealed higher than expected costs. Contracts were upheld as written. Transparency existed. Comprehension did not. 15. In 2013, corporations used tax inversion strategies to relocate headquarters on paper while maintaining operations domestically. Treasury reports acknowledged revenue losses but cited statutory limits. The transactions followed the code precisely. The outcome contradicted its intent. 16 federal agencies in the 2000s increasingly relied on deferred prosecution agreements to resolve corporate misconduct. Justice Department guidelines permitted the practice. Critics noted reduced trials and public records. Accountability became negotiated rather than tested. 17. Campaign finance filings from the 2014 cycle showed a surge in independent expenditures by nonprofit groups. FEC reports listed donors as undisclosed under existing rules. The spending was legal. The origin of influence remained abstract. 18. In multiple instances, regulators approved mergers after companies promised future compliance remedies. Antitrust reviews documented conditions. Market concentration still increased. The approvals followed procedure. The outcomes raised questions years later. 19. Government audits have repeatedly found agencies awarding contracts to repeat offenders due to limited vendor pools. Procurement rules allowed the awards. Oversight reports flagged concerns without prohibitions. Past behavior was noted. Eligibility persisted. By the late 2000s, ethics disclosures showed officials recusing themselves from decisions while their offices continued related work. Compliance was documented. Influence shifted channels rather than disappearing. The rule was followed. The effect remained. By examples, the pattern shifts from loopholes to architecture. This isn't corruption slipping through cracks. It's corruption moving through designated channels. The mechanisms repeat. Settlements without admissions, disclosures without deterrence, recusals without insulation. Each step looks responsible in isolation. Together, they form a system where outcomes matter less than process. What's strange isn't that influence exists. It's that it's measured, reported, and accepted as long as the paperwork is correct. Enforcement appears after decisions are finalized. Oversight arrives with recommendations instead of reversals. Transparency functions as documentation, not interruption. Nothing here depends on secrecy. It depends on timing. By the time questions are asked, the result is already locked in. And because the rules were followed, the outcome becomes difficult to challenge. At this stage, corruption doesn't look dramatic. It looks organized, not hidden, just scheduled. In the early 2000s, federal agencies routinely hired contractors who later helped write the regulations governing their own work. Ethics disclosures documented the relationships, and revolving door rules were technically followed. Oversight reports noted best practices concerns, without prohibitions. The conflict was acknowledged, the workflow continued. During the 2010s, banks paid recurring fines for compliance failures tied to the same practices. Regulatory filings showed penalties increasing incrementally, while profits grew faster. Enforcement was consistent, deterrence was not. Several states approved infrastructure projects after feasibility studies funded by the same companies bidding on the work. Disclosure statements listed funding sources. Audits later flagged optimism bias. The studies met formal requirements. The conclusions favored the sponsors. In 2014, government watchdogs reported that agencies relied on industry data to assess industry risk. Methodologies were disclosed and peer-reviewed. Independence was assumed through process, not separation. Oversight used the numbers it was given. Across the 2000s, 10s, corporations negotiated non-monetary compliance agreements in lieu of stricter penalties. Settlement documents outlined future promises rather than past accountability. Courts approved the terms. The cost was deferred. Campaign finance records show that independent groups routinely spent on ads aligned with candidates' messaging. Legal definitions prohibited coordination, not alignment. FEC filings confirmed compliance. Influence traveled parallel paths. 27 federal procurement rules allowed repeat contractors to receive awards despite documented performance issues. Inspector General reports cited limited competition as justification. Past failures were recorded. Eligibility remained unchanged. 28. In multiple antitrust cases, regulators approved mergers after companies agreed to divest minor assets. Review documents noted concerns but emphasized negotiated remedies. Market concentration still increased. The approvals followed the checklist. 29. Ethics filings show officials reporting gifts, travel, or consulting income within legal thresholds. The disclosures were timely and complete. Oversight bodies reviewed them without action. Transparency functioned as compliance, not constraint. 3. By the late 2010s, agencies increasingly outsourced enforcement monitoring back to regulated entities. Audit trails existed, verification was indirect. Compliance was measured by reports generated by the subjects themselves. At this point, the pattern stops looking accidental. What keeps repeating isn't misconduct, it's accommodation. Each mechanism is designed to appear responsible on its own. Disclosures inform. Settlements resolve. Reviews document concern. But none of them interrupt momentum. Influence doesn't push against the system here. It moves with it, through procedures meant to manage risk, not eliminate it. The strange part isn't that conflicts are hidden. It's that they're acknowledged and processed without friction. Problems are identified after decisions are finalized. Corrections are proposed without altering outcomes. Oversight becomes a record of awareness rather than a source of restraint. By now, corruption doesn't look dramatic or secretive. It looks scheduled. Not because rules are absent, but because the rules are optimized for continuity. And once continuity becomes the priority, the difference between prevention and documentation quietly disappears. In the 1990s, federal agencies repeatedly waived conflict of interest restrictions to retain specialized consultants. Waivers were documented and approved internally. Inspector General reviews later noted the practice, but cited staffing shortages. Expertise was preserved, independence was negotiated. During the 2000s, states issued tax incentives to corporations that failed to meet job creation targets. Audit reports confirmed the shortfalls. Clawback provisions existed, but were rarely enforced. The incentives followed statute. Accountability remained optional. 33. In multiple years, Congress renewed temporary tax provisions through last-minute packages, benefiting specific industries. Legislative records showed sponsor input from affected sectors. The measures passed procedurally. Public review was limited by timing. 34. Regulatory agencies in the 2000s approved industry-backed standards that later became de facto rules. Comment periods were completed as required. Oversight bodies flagged heavy industry participation. Consensus replaced independence. 35. Federal disaster funds were allocated through formulas favoring repeat contractors with established compliance histories. GAO reports noted concentration risk but cited efficiency gains. Distribution was legal, competition narrowed. 36. In several antitrust settlements, companies agreed to behavioral remedies monitored by third-party trustees selected with defendant input. Court approvals cited practicality. Follow-up reviews found mixed compliance. Oversight was outsourced by design. 37 campaign finance records show candidates refunding small donations deemed problematic while retaining larger, compliant contributions from aligned interests. FEC guidance allowed the practice. Ethics was managed by thresholds. 38. Across the 2010s, agencies used cost-benefit analyses supplied partly by regulated industries. Methodologies were disclosed and accepted. Critics questioned assumptions after adoption. The math met standards. The outcomes favored incumbents. 39. Federal courts approved class action settlements that returned minimal compensation to claimants while awarding substantial fees. Judges cited precedent and efficiency. The cases closed cleanly. Relief was symbolic. 40. By the late 2010s, public-private partnerships increasingly transferred long-term revenue rights to private operators. Contract terms were public. Renegotiations followed when forecasts fell short. Risk was shared, on paper. By now, the system isn't reacting to corruption. It's managing it. What repeats across these cases isn't failure of oversight, but the normalization of exception. Waivers are granted. Deadlines are rushed. Standards are negotiated. Each step is justified as practical, efficient, or necessary. Together, they form a rhythm where rules exist primarily to be adjusted. What's most revealing is how often risk is acknowledged without being absorbed. Warnings are documented. Concerns are footnoted. Recommendations are deferred. Nothing here requires secrecy. Everything happens in the open, framed as trade-offs rather than choices. By this stage, corruption doesn't rely on influence alone. It relies on fatigue. Oversight bodies know the problems. Legislators recognize the patterns. Institutions record the same issues year after year. And because the process remains compliant, continuity becomes easier than correction. The system doesn't collapse under corruption. It adapts to it, quietly, procedurally, on schedule. In the early 2000s, federal agencies approved consent decrees, allowing corporations to self-monitor compliance. Court documents outlined reporting obligations. Follow-up audits later found repeat issues. Oversight existed. Verification was indirect by design. During the 2010s, states granted economic development subsidies with performance metrics evaluated years later. Audit reports confirmed missed targets. Repayment clauses were rarely triggered. Incentives moved faster than accountability. Multiple agencies relied on advisory committees, dominated by industry representatives. Membership lists were public and compliant. Recommendations aligned with sponsor interests. Balance was procedural, not proportional. In several procurement programs, agencies used best value scoring that weighted vendor experience heavily. Evaluation records showed incumbents winning repeatedly. The criteria were lawful. Competition narrowed predictably. 45 regulators approved settlements that capped penalties below statutory maximums, citing cooperation. Filings documented extensive negotiations. Deterrence was discussed. Discounts were applied. 46. Campaign finance rules allowed donors to split contributions across entities within limits. FEC filings showed compliance. Aggregate influence increased without exceeding caps. The structure scaled legally. 47. Agencies issued guidance in place of formal rulemaking to accelerate policy. Guidance documents were non-binding, yet treated as standards. Oversight reviews noted blurred lines. Speed replaced scrutiny. 48. Public pension funds adopted fee structures tied to complex benchmarks. Disclosures were complete but technical. Subsequent reviews found higher costs than projections. Transparency didn't simplify outcomes. 49. Government watchdogs repeatedly flagged the same deficiencies across annual reports. Responses acknowledged concerns and pledged future fixes. Timelines extended. Findings accumulated. 50. By the late 2010s, enforcement actions increasingly ended with compliance programs, overseen by consultants, approved by defendants. Court approval cited practicality. Independence was procedural. Closure arrived without precedent-setting rulings. By the end, the pattern isn't subtle anymore. It isn't about bad actors slipping through cracks. It's about a system that expects influence and builds lanes for it. Across all 50 cases, the same structure repeats. Disclosure replaces prevention. Settlements replace judgment. Process replaces consequence. Nothing here relies on secrecy. Everything relies on compliance. Money doesn't need to corrupt the system from the outside when it can operate comfortably within it. Influence is logged, reviewed, and allowed to proceed as long as it follows the correct steps. Oversight arrives, but late. Penalties exist, but scale poorly. Warnings are issued, but rarely interrupt outcomes already in motion. What makes these facts ridiculous isn't how shocking they are. It's how normal they look once you understand the workflow. At that point, corruption stops feeling like a violation. It feels like administration. Not hidden, not denied, just processed. And when corruption becomes procedural, the question is no longer who broke the rules. It's who designed them to work this way. Looking back, none of these facts depended on secrecy. They depended on familiarity. Each example followed rules that already existed. Forms were filed, deadlines were met, procedures were respected. And because the process looked legitimate, the outcome rarely felt urgent enough to stop. This is what makes corruption in the U.S. difficult to confront. It doesn't always arrive as a scandal. It arrives as a workflow. Influence is disclosed instead of blocked. Penalties are negotiated instead of tested. Oversight documents concern after decisions are finalized. Nothing here required bad intentions, only incentives that rewarded continuity over correction. When rules are written to manage behavior rather than prevent it, violations stop feeling exceptional. They become predictable. Over time, the system doesn't collapse under corruption, it adjusts to it. The strange part isn't that money shapes outcomes. It's how openly that shaping occurs and how rarely the process itself is questioned. Most people interacting with these systems will never feel like anything went wrong because nothing visibly broke. But history tends to record these moments anyway, not as crimes, but as patterns. Patterns where influence didn't need to hide because it learned how to comply. And once corruption becomes procedural, the challenge is no longer exposing it. It's deciding whether a system designed to absorb it was ever meant to stop it at all.